The collar weighs exactly 1.3 kilograms, and I know this because I have felt every gram of it pressed against my throat for 372 days. It is made of reinforced ceramite alloy, painted the dull orange that marks Penal Legion property throughout the Imperium, and it contains within its 2-centimeter thickness enough explosive charge to sever my head from my shoulders in a fraction of a second. The detonator is controlled remotely by Sergeant Vekan, who walks 15 meters behind our formation at all times with his hand resting casually on the transmitter unit clipped to his belt. His finger never more than a twitch away from sending any one of us into immediate darkness. I think about that finger constantly. When I am walking, when I am eating my ration of corpse starch paste, when I am trying to sleep on the frozen ground of whatever world we have been deployed to this month. I think about the twitch, the signal, the explosion, the end. It has become my meditation, my prayer, my constant companion, more intimate than fear or hope or any emotion that requires a future extending beyond the next heartbeat. My name was Jarek Saris, though that name ceased to have legal existence the moment the arbitrators sentenced me to penal battalion service. Now I am convict legionnaire, 773 of the 19th Savla Penal Legion, 3rd Company, 2nd Platoon, and that designation is tattooed across my forehead in numbers 3 centimeters high, so that anyone who looks at me understands immediately what I am, the property, temporarily animate, scheduled for disposal through combat attrition at the earliest convenient opportunity. I am 26 years old. I've been in the Penal Legion for 1 standard year. The average life expectancy for a penal legionnaire after deployment is 43 days. I am already a statistical anomaly, an outlier who has survived long enough to understand with perfect clarity that survival is not mercy, but prolonged execution. Before the collar, before the numbers burned into my skin, before I learned what it meant to be truly expendable, I was a factory worker on Mordian, assembling lasgun power cells in Manufactorum District 7 Gamma. My father was a shift supervisor. My uncle served in the Iron Guard before losing both legs to an orc chopper blade during the defense of Hive Mordax. I grew up believing in the Imperium's justice, in the divine protection of the Emperor, in the idea that service and sacrifice had meaning beyond their immediate function. I was young and stupid and possessed of the kind of naive faith that only ignorance can sustain. The universe corrected that failing with systematic thoroughness. My crime was theft. Not grand larceny, not treason, not murder or heresy, or any of the dramatic transgressions that might warrant a narrative more compelling than simple desperation. I stole 14 power cells from the Manufactorum stockpile because my father was dying from lung disease contracted through 3 decades of breathing toxic fumes, and the Medica facility would only treat him if I could pay 17 thrones for the respiratory drugs he needed. 14 power cells, worth perhaps 20 thrones total on the black market. I was caught during my second sale, reported by an undercover Arbeits informant, arrested within the hour, tried within the day, and sentenced within the week. The Arbeits judge who pronounced my fate did so without looking at me, reading from a data slate in a voice that suggested he had delivered the same sentence hundreds of times before and would deliver it hundreds of times again. Convict Legionnaire service, duration indefinite, deployment immediate. May your sacrifice redeem our sin against the Emperor's Imperium. My father died 3 days after my sentencing, alone in a charity ward, drowning in fluids his lungs could no longer expel. I was informed of his death by a notification slip pushed through the meal slot in my holding cell. The slip contained his name, his date of death, and a brief notation. Body processed for reclamation. No personal effects recovered. I kept that slip for 2 hours before it was confiscated during my transfer to the Penal Battalion processing facility. It was the last connection I had to anything that existed before the collar, and they took it because penal legionnaires are not permitted to maintain attachments to their former lives. Everything before the collar is erased. Everything after the collar is service unto death, and death is the only form of release authorized by imperial decree. The processing facility on Mordian was located in the lower hive levels, deep enough that natural light never reached the corridors and the air tasted of industrial runoff and human misery. I spent 16 days there alongside 237 other convicted criminals, undergoing what the facility documentation called reorientation training, but what functioned in practice as systematic brutalization designed to break any remaining spirit or resistance we might possess. We were stripped of our clothing and personal identifiers. We were shaved completely, heads, faces, bodies, until we were as hairless and indistinct as newborns. We were tattooed with our convict numbers and penal legion designation. We were injected with tracking implants that would allow our handlers to monitor our locations and vital signs at all times. We were fitted with the collars, each one calibrated specifically to our neck measurements, locked into place with molecular bonding seals that could not be removed without specialized equipment, and activated with a soft click that sounded like a door closing forever. The guard who fitted my collar was a tech priest Engenseer, his face hidden behind a rebreather mask, his hands already halfway to mechanical augmentation. He worked in absolute silence, adjusting the collar's position with precision, testing the locking mechanism, verifying the explosive charge, and finally activating the remote detonation system. When he finished, he placed one cold metal finger beneath the collar and lifted my chin until I was forced to meet the red glow of his augmetic eyes. "Do not misunderstand the purpose of this device," he said, his voice rendered flat and toneless by the vox amplifier in his throat. "It exists not to kill you, that is inevitable regardless, but to ensure you die usefully. Your life has been revalued from its previous parameters and found deficient. The collar corrects this deficiency by providing your existence with terminal utility. You will serve, you will obey. You will die when directed. These are your only remaining functions. Departure from these functions will result in immediate termination. Do you comprehend?" I nodded because speech seemed impossible with the weight of the collar and the enormity of what it represented pressing against my throat like a physical hand. "Vocalize your comprehension," the tech priest commanded. "I comprehend," I managed, and my voice sounded thin and distant, as if it were coming from someone else, from some version of me that still existed in the before time and was calling across an unbridgeable distance. "Acceptable," the tech priest said, and moved to the next convict in line, and I understood that I had just participated in my own funeral, spoken my own eulogy, and what remained was not life but animated death awaiting final disposal. If this glimpse into the systematic dehumanization of the condemned already weighs on your heart, leave the word "witnessed" in the comments below, and subscribe so their story endures beyond the meat grinder. We were deployed to our first combat zone 11 days after processing concluded. The troop transport that carried us was a converted bulk freighter. Its cargo holds refitted to accommodate human cargo with the absolute minimum necessary life support infrastructure. 400 convict legionnaires packed into a space designed for 200, with lighting so dim you could barely distinguish faces, ventilation so inadequate that the air became thick with the smell of sweat and fear, and the chemical tang of the tranquilizer drugs they pumped through the atmospheric system to keep us manageable during transit. We spent 3 weeks in that hold, traveling through the warp to a destination we were not informed of because Penal legionnaires do not require strategic briefings. We require only coordinates for where to die. The world they deployed us to was designated Tertius 9, a frontier mining planet that had fallen to Orc occupation 6 months prior, and that the Imperial Guard was attempting to reclaim through sustained offensive operations. Our role in those operations was explained to us by Commander Gresk, the Penal battalion officer responsible for our deployment, in a briefing that lasted exactly 90 seconds and contained no information beyond essential instructions for our immediate disposal. The Orcs have fortified the mining complexes with anti-vehicle defenses and minefields, Gresk said, addressing us from behind a force field barrier while we stood in formation on the landing field, colors glowing faintly in the dim light of Tertius 9's red dwarf sun. Regular Guard infantry cannot advance until these defenses are neutralized. You will advance ahead of the main force. You will trigger the mines. You will draw the Orc fire. You will create gaps in their defensive positions. Those of you who survive, and command estimates survival probability at approximately 8%, will regroup for secondary deployment. Mission duration estimated 40 minutes. Collar detonation will occur for any legionnaire who retreats, who fails to advance on command, or who displays cowardice. The Emperor protects. Dismissed. 8%. 40 minutes. Those numbers became the framework for understanding my immediate future as I stood in that formation and felt the collar's weight pressing against my pulse. I would be dead before the local sun completed 1 degree of arc across the sky. Dead in a minefield, torn apart by explosives buried beneath alien soil, contributing my biological matter to the statistical probability calculations that would allow properly valued human beings to advance safely across ground I'd paid for with my scattered atoms. This was redemption as the Imperium defined it. Not forgiveness, not restoration, not even acknowledgement of humanity, but useful disposal of defective resources. We advanced 1 hour later in waves of 50, spread across a 2-kilometer front, walking through scrubland that had been strip-mined until it resembled lunar terrain, all rock and dust and lifeless gray soil. I was in the 3rd wave, positioned between Convict Legionnaire 449, a murderer from Necromunda who had killed 3 men in a Hab-block dispute, and Convict Legionnaire 821, a former administratum clerk who had been convicted of falsifying tithe records. We did not speak. Speech seemed pointless when the only future we shared was measured in minutes and consisted entirely of waiting for the ground beneath our feet to explode. The mines began detonating when the first wave was approximately 300 meters ahead of our position. I watched men vanish into clouds of dirt and flame, saw bodies launched into the air by blast forces, strong enough to rip limbs from torsos, heard the screams that came before the shock waves and the silence that came after. The mines were pattern scattered, meaning there was no safe path, no route that could be calculated or predicted. You simply walked and hoped your next step did not land on a pressure plate, and when hope failed, as it inevitably did, you died screaming, or died instantly, or died over the course of agonizing seconds, while your body processed the fact that significant portions of it were no longer attached. 449 detonated a mine when we were 200 meters into the advance. One moment he was walking beside me, his breathing harsh and rapid, his hands clenched into fists. The next moment there was an explosion that felt like being punched in the chest by something larger than imagination, and I was on the ground with dirt in my mouth and blood in my eyes. And when I could see again, 449 was a crater containing pieces too small to identify as human. 821 was crying, making high-pitched sounds of terror that should not come from an adult man, and Sergeant Vecken's voice came through the vox castus that every convict legionnaire carried on their chest webbing. Advance or detonate? Choose now. I stood. 821 stood. We continued walking across a field that was trying to kill us with every step, advancing toward fortifications we could now see in the distance. Crude orc bunkers made of scrap metal and welded together with complete disregard for engineering principles, but effective nonetheless. The orcs were firing now, slugger rounds and shooter fire cutting through the air with sounds like fabric tearing, and legionnaires ahead of us were dropping from gunfire as well as mines. And I realized the 8% survival estimate was probably optimistic. I walked through that minefield for 37 minutes. I do not know how I survived. Luck, perhaps, or statistical variance, or the grim possibility that I simply happened to place my feet in the exact sequence of positions that avoided pressure plates through pure random chance. Men died on my left and my right. Men died ahead and behind. Men detonated collars when they froze in terror, unable to advance but unwilling to trigger mines, choosing the certainty of immediate death over the probability of imminent death. By the time I reached the orc defensive positions, my hearing was damaged from blast overpressure. My vision was blurred from dirt and blood, and I had urinated myself at some point without noticing, because fear had overridden every automatic function, except the one that kept my legs moving forward. The orcs came out to meet us. 40 or 50 of the green-skinned Xenos, larger than men, brutal and direct in their violence. And we fought them with laser guns and bayonets and desperation. I killed 3 orcs during that engagement, shooting one in the face from a distance of 2 meters, stabbing another in the throat when my laser gun's power cell ran dry, and beating the third to death with a rock when it tried to choke me with its bare hands. I do not remember most of the details. Combat became a blur of motion and impact, adrenaline and terror compressed into a space where thought ceased and only action remained. When it ended, I was alive, covered in blood that was not entirely my own, standing among the corpses of Xenos and fellow legionnaires, breathing air that tasted of promethium and burned flesh. 17 of us survived from the 3 waves totaling 150 legionnaires. 17. An 11% survival rate, slightly better than Command's estimate. We had cleared the minefield. We had neutralized the orc defensive position. We had fulfilled our function. The main guard force advanced through the gaps we had created, marching past us without acknowledgement, and we were ordered to regroup at a collection point 3 kilometers to the rear, where we would await our next deployment. Should any human being be used this way, as living detonators for explosives they did nothing to deserve facing? If you believe they deserved better, let your like be the mercy they never received. I learned quickly that survival in the Penal Legion was not about skill or courage or tactical brilliance. It was about accepting that you are already dead and allowing that acceptance to remove the fear that caused others to freeze or panic or make the mistakes that killed them. The legionnaires who survived longest were the ones who had internalized their own expendability so completely that they could walk through minefields or charge fortified positions or clear building to building in urban combat zones with the mechanical detachment of servitors performing programmed function. We became something less than human, but more than machines, existing in a liminal state between life and death, where the collar was our constant reminder that we belonged to neither category, completely. Our second deployment came 4 days after Tertius 9, barely enough time for our wounds to scab over and our hearing to partially recover. We were transported to a jungle world designated Viridian 4, where chaos cultists had entrenched themselves in ruins from some previous human civilization and were using the terrain to conduct guerrilla operations against Imperial forces. Our mission was described in the same efficiently brutal terms as our first deployment. Advance through the jungle, trigger the cult's ambush positions, absorb their initial attacks, create targeting opportunities for the regular guard units following behind us. Estimated survival probability, 12%. Mission duration, 3 hours. The jungle was hot and humid, with canopy so thick that the ground existed in permanent twilight and air that felt like breathing soup. The cultists had rigged the entire area with traps, not sophisticated military ordnance, but improvised devices made from scavenged materials, crude but effective. Tripwires connected to grenades, pits lined with sharpened stakes, deadfalls that dropped logs or rock slides onto pathways. We triggered them systematically, walking through the jungle in spread formation, marking trap locations with our corpses so the soldiers behind us could advance safely. Convict Legionnaire 235 stepped on a pressure plate that released a swinging log studded with scrap metal spikes. The log hit him at chest height, the spikes penetrating his torso in a dozen places, and he hung there, impaled and dying, for nearly 5 minutes before blood loss or shock finally killed him, and he could be cut down. The cultists themselves were even worse than their traps. They had been human once. You could see it in their basic morphology, the bipedal structure, the tool-using hands, but chaos corruption had altered them in ways that violated fundamental categories of being. Some had extra limbs growing from impossible locations. Others had faces that moved wrong, mouths where eyes should be, teeth emerging from skin. They attacked from ambush, using autoguns and stubbers and improvised melee weapons, and they screamed prayers to gods whose names I will not repeat because some words should not be spoken even in memory. We fought them building by building through the ruins, shooting and stabbing and bludgeoning, and I watched men I had shared transport space with die screaming as cultist blades opened them from groin to throat, spilling intestines onto jungle soil that seemed to writhe and twist as if the corruption extended into the ground itself. I killed 17 cultists during that engagement. I counted. Not out of pride, but out of desperate need to maintain some form of accounting, some recognition that these deaths meant something beyond their tactical utility. Each kill was a small proof that I was still capable of agency, still possessed enough will and capacity to fight rather than simply dying when directed. It was a pathetic form of resistance, insignificant in every meaningful sense, but it was the only form available to someone wearing a collar that could end them at any moment. We lost 83 Legionnaires during the Viridian 4 operation. 37 survived. Command considered this an acceptable ratio. We were commended, not praised, not rewarded, but formally acknowledged via Vox transmission for our effectiveness in identifying and triggering enemy defensive positions. Then we were loaded back onto the transport and shipped to our next deployment without time for recovery or rest beyond the minimum necessary to prevent complete physical collapse. The cycle continued. World after world, mission after mission, walking through minefields and charging fortified positions and clearing buildings room by room in urban combat zones where every doorway might contain death and every corner might hide an enemy. Tertius 9, Viridian 4, Helgast Minor, Crestellen, Vos Prime. The names blurred together into a continuous sequence of deployment and combat and death, differentiated only by the specific methods used to kill us. Minefields, ambushes, direct assaults, chemical weapons testing, ours, not the enemy's. Command wanted data on how effective certain toxins were against human targets before deploying them in larger operations. Orbital insertion, without proper grav chutes, 16% survival rate, considered acceptable for the tactical advantage gained. Tunnel clearance in underground complexes where the air was too thin to support sustained combat, and men died from hypoxia before the enemy could kill them. I survived because I became very good at being expendable. I learned to read terrain for likely trap locations. I learned to identify which defensive positions were genuine threats versus which were decoys designed to draw fire. I learned to move through urban environments using routes that minimized exposure while maximizing the probability that someone else would trigger the trap instead of me. I learned to fight with efficiency rather than passion, conserving ammunition and energy, using the minimum force necessary to neutralize threats, because every wasted shot or unnecessary exertion increased the probability of fatal error. I became a specialist in survival through systematic application of tactical selfishness, and the fact that my survival often came at the cost of other legionnaires dying in my place was a moral burden I simply stopped carrying because morality was a luxury that required a future, and futures did not exist for men wearing explosive collars. The other survivors developed similar adaptations. Convict Legionnaire 384, a former gang enforcer who had killed 12 people before his arrest, became our de facto squad leader through sheer persistence and tactical competence. Convict Legionnaire 667, a tech heretic who had been caught modifying his augmetics beyond approved parameters, learned to disable certain types of traps and became invaluable for route clearance. Convict Legionnaire 913, whose original crime I never learned, developed an ability to remain calm under fire that bordered on supernatural, continuing to function and fight in situations where normal men would have collapsed from stress or trauma. We formed a unit not out of friendship or camaraderie, but out of mutual recognition that we had all survived long enough to develop skills worth preserving as long as the Imperium continued finding uses for expendable assets. The moment of understanding that you are already dead has arrived. If you believe any of them deserve choice, show it, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from today, so someone knows you bore witness to their disposal. The collar never stopped being present. Even when you were not consciously thinking about it, you felt its weight, its pressure, the slight chafing where the edge rubbed against skin. You could not shower without being conscious of the waterproof seal that protected the detonation mechanism. You could not sleep without positioning your head carefully to avoid uncomfortable pressure. You could not scratch an itch on your neck without your fingers brushing against ceramite and being reminded that your continued existence was contingent on someone else's discretion. The collar became part of your body schema, integrated into your physical self-image the way a prosthetic limb might be, except instead of replacing missing function, it represented the constant imminence of termination. Sergeant Veckan detonated collars with disturbing frequency, often for infractions that seemed minor or ambiguous. Convict Legionnaire 559 had his collar detonated because he questioned an order, not refused it, not disobeyed it, simply asked for clarification about whether he was supposed to advance through a doorway or breach through a window. Veckan detonated him mid-sentence. One moment the Legionnaire was speaking. The next moment there was a sharp crack like a laser gun shot, and his head was separating from his shoulders in a spray of blood and spinal fluid. His body continued standing for nearly 3 seconds before collapsing, and Veckan did not even pause in delivering the rest of his tactical instructions. Through the doorway, obviously. Move. We moved, because the alternative was joining 559 as a headless corpse, and because we had all internalized the fundamental reality that our lives held no value beyond their immediate utility, and utility was defined entirely by our handler's assessment of whether we were more useful alive or dead at any given moment. This was not injustice. This was not cruelty, though it certainly appeared cruel to anyone observing from outside the system. This was simply the logical implementation of a penal system designed to extract maximum utility from human resources that had been deemed effective through criminal behavior. We had violated the Imperium's laws. We had been found guilty. This was our sentence, and the sentence was death, merely distributed across time and space and delivered in increments calibrated to maximize our tactical value before final disposal. After 6 months of continuous deployment, I had witnessed 147 collar detonations. Some were justified by any reasonable standard. Legionnaires who actually refused orders, who attempted to flee combat zones, who attacked other legionnaires or even handlers. Others were less clearly justified, executed for being too slow, for showing insufficient enthusiasm, for having the misfortune of annoying a handler during a moment when that handler wanted to demonstrate authority. The collars did not distinguish between legitimate discipline and arbitrary violence. They simply detonated when activated, and the men wearing them simply died, and the rest of us continued serving because continuing was the only option available until our own collars detonated, and we joined the statistical accounting of acceptable losses. I stopped remembering names after the first 100 deaths, stopped forming even the minimal social connections that might constitute acknowledgement of shared humanity. Every legionnaire became a number, a temporary occupant of a position in formation, a tactical resource with limited duration. When they died, I noted their absence the same way you might note a malfunctioning piece of equipment, with brief acknowledgement that a resource had been expended and would need to be replaced, but without emotional investment in the specific identity of what had been lost. This was not sociopathy. This was adaptation. The human mind cannot sustain constant grief over constantly dying companions. Eventually, the mind protects itself by simply stopping the formation of attachments that will only produce pain when severed. My mother's face was fading from memory. I realized this during a rest period between deployments, lying on my transport bunk and trying to visualize her features. I could remember the general impression: kind eyes, smile lines around her mouth, hair that she wore pulled back in a practical style, but the specific details were eroding, becoming less distinct, like a photograph left in sunlight until the image bleached away to vague shapes. I tried to hold on to those details, actively forcing myself to recall them, but the effort was increasingly difficult because my brain had apparently decided that storing tactical information about minefield patterns and enemy ambush tactics was more survival relevant than maintaining memories of a woman who was probably already dead and who belonged to a version of myself that had ceased to exist the moment the collar locked around my neck. I wondered if this was intentional. If the Imperium's penal system had been designed not just to extract tactical utility, but to systematically erase the criminal's previous identity, transforming them from individual human beings with histories and connections into blank slate resources whose entire existence consisted of service and death. The collar was the physical manifestation of this erasure, but the deeper erasure occurred psychologically through the constant trauma and death and dehumanization that gradually hollowed out whatever had existed before, until nothing remained except the functional behaviors necessary for continued deployment. We were being converted into human-shaped weapons, guided missiles made of flesh instead of metal, launched at enemy positions with the understanding that we would detonate on contact and the debris would not require cleanup because debris was all we had ever been. On Castellan, during an urban siege operation, I watched Convict Legionnaire 384, our unofficial squad leader, the man who had survived longer than anyone else in our unit, finally break under the accumulated weight of everything we had endured. We were clearing a hab block that had been fortified by enemy forces, working floor by floor through rooms that reeked of death and promethium, and 384 suddenly stopped moving. Just froze in the middle of a corridor, his laser gun hanging loose in his hands, his eyes focused on something none of us could see. Sergeant Vekan ordered him to advance. He did not move. Vekan repeated the order. 384 turned slowly and looked at Vekan with an expression of such profound exhaustion that it transcended despair and entered some territory beyond where emotions ceased having names. "No," 384 said quietly. Just that single word. No elaboration, no explanation, no plea. Simply refusal. Vekan reached for his detonator. 384 made no attempt to fight or flee or even close his eyes. He just stood there, waiting. And I saw in his face the recognition that he had finally found the one thing we were all searching for, an end that arrived on his own terms, through his own choice, rather than being inflicted by enemy action or random chance. The collar detonated, his head separated, his body fell, and the rest of us stepped over his corpse and continued advancing because that was what we did, had always done, would continue doing, until our own collars detonated and someone else stepped over our corpses in turn. This cycle has repeated across 1,000 worlds, consuming millions of convicted souls as ammunition against the Imperium's enemies. If you think it must end, let your engagement be the prayer the Emperor never answered. Like and subscribe. After 1 year of service, I had been deployed on 37 separate operations across 21 different worlds. I had survived encounters that killed 92% of the other legionnaires deployed alongside me. I had walked through 14 separate minefields, cleared 11 urban combat zones, assaulted 6 fortified positions, conducted 4 orbital insertion drops, and participated in 3 chemical weapons exposure tests. My body carried scars from shrapnel, burns from promethium, lesions from toxin exposure, and chronic pain in my left leg from a partially healed fracture I had sustained during a fall from a collapsing structure. My psychological state was difficult to assess because assessment required sufficient self-awareness to recognize what had been lost, and I was no longer certain I possessed that capacity. Command reclassified me as a veteran asset after I survived my 30th operation. Not a promotion, not a reward, but a designation indicating I had accumulated sufficient experience to be assigned to slightly less suicidal missions as a force multiplier for newer legionnaires. This meant I was now deployed on operations with 40% survival probability instead of 8%. Tasked with leading squads of fresh convicts through their initial deployments and attempting to maximize their tactical effectiveness before they died. I became what 384 had been before his final refusal, a temporary authority figure whose job was to shepherd condemned men toward useful deaths while delaying my own useful death through marginal improvements in tactical competence. The new convicts arrived in waves, processed through the same facilities I had been processed through, tattooed and collared and stripped of identity in the same systematic fashion. They asked the same questions I had asked, about redemption, about possible pardon, about whether survival might lead to reinstatement as regular guard troops or civilian status. I gave them the same answer 384 had given me during my first deployment. You're already dead. The only question is whether your death will be useful. Make it useful, and perhaps something of you will matter beyond the tactical reports. That's the only redemption available. Some of them believed this. Most did not want to believe it, but came to believe it anyway through direct experience of exactly how expendable they were. A few never accepted it, choosing instead to maintain hope that somehow they would be the exception, that their service would be recognized and rewarded, that they would survive long enough to be released. Those men died quickly, usually during their first or second deployment, because hope created hesitation, and hesitation created mistakes. Mistakes created corpses. I watched them die with the same detached acknowledgement I had developed for all deaths, noting their tactical failures and incorporating lessons learned into my own survival protocols. Convict Legionnaire 894. A young man, perhaps 20 years old, who had been convicted of sedition for distributing prohibited literature, lasted 17 minutes during his first deployment. He froze when enemy fire started, unable to process the visceral reality of combat after a lifetime of theoretical violence experienced through vid feeds and propaganda reels. I tried to move him, shouting orders and physically pushing him toward cover, but he simply stood paralyzed in the open until a stubber round took him in the chest. He died quickly, which was a mercy of a sort, and I took his ammunition and continued advancing because wasting resources on dead men was illogical, and I'd been operating on pure logic for so long that other response patterns had atrophied to vestigial status. Convict Legionnaire 221, a middle-aged man who had been convicted of embezzlement, lasted 3 days. He was competent enough in basic combat, following orders and maintaining formation, but he could not stop talking about his wife and children. Kept describing them in exhaustive detail during rest periods, showing anyone who would look the prayer scraps he had managed to conceal during processing that contained their names. Sergeant Vecken eventually detonated his collar, simply to stop the constant talking, which Vecken claimed was undermining unit cohesion through excessive emotional attachment, incompatible with effective penal service. 221 died mid-sentence, describing his daughter's 5th birthday celebration, and his last word was her name, and I do not remember what that name was, because remembering seemed like participating in the very behavior that had gotten him killed. Convict Legionnaire 476 lasted 6 weeks, long enough to develop basic competence before being killed by a Chaos cultist blade during close quarters fighting in a hive undercity. The cultist had aimed for the throat, but 476 had raised his arm reflexively, and the blade severed his arm at the elbow instead. He bled out over the course of 4 minutes while the rest of us secured the position, and his final words were not a prayer or a declaration, but a simple question. Was it enough? I told him yes, because the alternative was telling him that nothing was ever enough, that no amount of service or suffering or sacrifice would ever be sufficient to redeem whatever crime had brought him to this point, and lying seemed kinder than truth in that final moment. I led 19 different squads over the course of 6 months as a veteran asset. Total deployment strength across those squads: 247 legionnaires. Total survivors: 31. I had become efficient at managing condemned resources, maximizing their tactical utility, extending their operational lifespan by marginal increments, while acknowledging that extension only delayed the inevitable rather than preventing it. This was leadership in the Penal Legion, not inspiring men toward victory, but shepherding them toward useful deaths, and measuring success not in objectives achieved, but in acceptable loss ratios and tactical advantage gained per convict expended. The Imperium called this redemption. I called it nothing because calling it anything required the kind of moral judgment I had systematically eliminated from my cognitive processes in favor of pure tactical assessment. Men died. Their deaths served purposes. Those purposes contributed to larger strategic objectives. The strategic objectives furthered imperial interests. Imperial interests were by definition justified because the Imperium was humanity's salvation, and anything that preserved the Imperium was therefore good, regardless of what methods it required. This was orthodoxy. Dogma so fundamental it existed beneath the level of questioning, and I had internalized it so completely that I no longer remembered what alternatives might look like or why alternatives might be desirable. As this nightmare reaches its conclusion after 1 year of systematic disposal, if any part of this moved you, give them the one thing they never had: recognition. Leave eternal in the comments after 14 months of service. I was deployed to a world designated Gehenna Prime, where word-bearers Chaos Space Marines had established a fortified position around an ancient shrine they were using for some ritual purpose. Command wanted disrupted. The mission parameters were unusual. Instead of being sent as expendable advanced troops to trigger defenses and absorb fire, we were assigned a direct objective: penetrate the shrine, plant melter charges on structural supports, detonate charges, withdraw. Estimated survival probability, 0%. Mission duration, 1 hour. This was not a combat operation. This was a suicide mission, and unlike our usual deployments, where death was highly probable but technically survivable through skill and luck, this operation was designed from inception to ensure no one returned. We were told this explicitly during the briefing. Commander Grask, who had overseen our deployments for the past year, addressed us with unusual directness. You will not survive this operation. The objective's strategic value outweighs all other considerations. You will plant charges. The charges will detonate. You will be inside the blast radius. This is not a deployment. This is an execution with tactical utility. You are being expended. Is this understood? We confirmed understanding because what else could we do? The collars ensured compliance. The system ensured continuation. We were already dead, had been dead since the moment the collars locked, and this was simply the moment when that death would be officially actualized and recorded in Imperial casualty reports. I felt nothing. Should have felt terror, rage, despair, something, but whatever mechanisms in my brain produced those emotions had apparently been damaged or destroyed by 14 months of continuous trauma, and all that remained was a hollow space where feelings used to exist. I assembled my equipment. I checked my weapons. I verified my melter charge was armed and functional. I prepared to die with the same methodical care I had applied to every previous deployment, because procedure was all I had left, and abandoning procedure would mean acknowledging that everything I had endured had been pointless, and that acknowledgement would require breaking through the psychological defenses I had built to survive. And breaking through those defenses would mean experiencing the full accumulated horror of everything the Penal Legion had done to me, and I did not have the capacity to survive that experience. We inserted via grav-chute drop, falling through Gehenna Prime's atmosphere in a maneuver that killed 3 Legionnaires before we even reached the ground when their chutes failed, and they impacted at terminal velocity. The shrine was located in a valley surrounded by jagged rock formations, a structure built from black stone and decorated with symbols I recognized as chaos iconography from briefing materials. Word-bearers were visible on the perimeter, massive figures in power armor, 8 feet tall and carrying bolters, each one capable of killing dozens of normal humans. We were 40 legionnaires carrying laser guns and demo charges. The tactical disparity was absolute. We advanced anyway, because that was what we did. The word-bearers opened fire when we were 500 meters from the shrine, bolter rounds exploding among our formation, each detonation killing or maiming multiple targets. I ran, not toward cover, but toward the objective, because survival instinct had been overridden by operational imperative, and operational imperative required reaching the shrine's interior and planting charges. Men fell around me, torn apart by mass-reactive rounds, or burned by plasma fire, or simply cut down by the sheer volume of fire the Chaos Space Marines could produce. I felt impacts against my flak armor, rounds that should have killed me but were deflected or absorbed by luck or geometry or divine intervention if such things existed. I reached the shrine entrance with 11 other legionnaires out of the original 40. The interior was worse than the exterior. A cathedral space decorated with blasphemous imagery and filled with cultists conducting some ritual that involved chanting and blood sacrifice and energies that made looking at them produce physical pain behind the eyes. We fought through the cultists using ammunition and bayonets and sheer, desperate violence, clearing a path to the support pillars where we were supposed to plant our charges. I killed 6 cultists during that advance, shooting 3 and stabbing 3 more, their blood hot and sticky on my hands, their faces twisted into expressions of ecstatic horror that suggested they welcomed death as communion with their dark gods. I reached my assigned pillar and began placing the melter charge, following the technical procedures I'd been trained on, setting timers and arming detonators while las fire and bolter rounds filled the air around me. The charge clicked into active status. The timer began counting down from 60 seconds. I looked around for extraction routes, knowing there were none, understanding that the blast radius would encompass the entire shrine structure and probably a 100-meter perimeter beyond. 53 seconds. 3 other legionnaires were still placing their charges, working with frantic speed while cultists and word-bearers closed in on our positions. 47 seconds. Someone, I never learned who, screamed a prayer to the Emperor, voice breaking with terror or faith or the collision of both. 39 seconds. Sergeant Vekan's voice came through the vox. Charges armed, withdrawal not authorized, all remaining legionnaires. Your service is complete. The Emperor protects. Then he detonated our collars. All of them. Every legionnaire still wearing one, every convicted criminal who had been deployed to this nightmare operation. All of us died in the same instant as our collars executed their primary function and severed our heads from our bodies. I felt the detonation signal reach my collar, felt the explosive charge activate, felt the beginning of the compression wave that would separate vertebrae and tear through tissue. Then I felt nothing, because nothing was all that remained. Nothing was what I had been from the beginning despite the elaborate performance of continued existence. Nothing was the final truth underlying every lie the Imperium had told about redemption and service and meaning. But I am still here, still remembering, still capable of forming these words and this narrative, which is impossible unless everything I just described was not ending but transformation, not death, but transition into something else, some state that persists beyond the collar's detonation and the body's destruction. I am no longer Convict Legionnaire 773. I am no longer Jarek Saris. I am not certain I am anything that possesses sufficient continuity to warrant a designation. But I am here, somehow, watching new legionnaires arrive in processing facilities, observing them being collared and deployed and expended, witnessing the system perpetuate itself across worlds and years, and the endless grinding consumption of human resources deemed defective and therefore expendable. I understand now what the Penal Legion truly is. Not punishment, not redemption, not even simple disposal of criminal populations. It is conversion, taking human beings who violated the Imperium's laws and transforming them into perfect examples of the Imperium's fundamental truth, that individuals mean nothing, that life has value only insofar as it serves larger systems, that death is not tragic but simply reallocation of resources from animate to inanimate status. Every legionnaire who dies wearing a collar becomes proof of this principle, demonstration that even the condemned can be useful if properly directed, evidence that the Imperium wastes nothing and values everything according to strict hierarchies of utility and expendability. The new legionnaires arrive. They are tattooed, they are collared, they are deployed. They die usefully. And something of them persists afterward, not as individuals, but as data points in casualty reports, as lessons learned by the survivors, as minor contributions to tactical knowledge that might save lives in future operations, or might simply enable more efficient disposal of future convicts. This is eternity in the Penal Legion, not continuation of self, but dissolution into system, becoming part of the machine that processes human resources and outputs corpses and maintains itself through the very act of destruction. I was 26 years old when I stole 14 power cells to buy medicine for my dying father. I am ageless now, or perhaps age has lost meaning when you exist as memory and data rather than flesh and breath. I committed theft. I was convicted. I served. I died. And the service continues, will always continue, because the Imperium requires disposal mechanisms for its condemned populations, and the Penal Legion performs that function with systematic efficiency, transforming crimes into tactical utility and criminals into ammunition. The Emperor protects, they say. But from this, there is no protection, only service, only collars and deployments and useful deaths. Only the grinding consumption of the condemned, processed through combat zones and minefield clearings and suicide missions until nothing remains, except the next wave of convicts ready for collaring, ready for deployment, ready to die usefully in service to an Imperium that values them only as resources to be expended. This is redemption, as the Imperium defines it. This is punishment that never ends because ending would require acknowledging that the punishment was finite, that crimes could be paid for, that humans could be restored to status beyond expendable. And acknowledging that would contradict the fundamental principle that makes the Imperium function, that everything is fuel for the machine, and some fuel is simply more disposable than the rest. Now you know what the Imperium truly costs its condemned, if you dare witness more truths about service and sacrifice. Subscribe. The Emperor protects, but the collar detonates regardless, and death is the only form of mercy authorized.